It's round one of Norway Chess, and I am here to bring you the highlights of the very first round. Today, it's Fabiano Caruana with the white pieces against Magnus Carlsen, and what a game it was. Let's have a look what happened in the game between the two titans. Fabiano opens up the game with 1e4, and after 1e4, Magnus plays the French defense. Maybe a bit of a surprise, but Magnus has been playing it before. Anyway, Fabiano's always very well prepared and comes up with an interesting idea in the opening. After the moves d4, d5, we get to see the classical variation, knight c3 and knight f6. White is advancing the pawn and the knight drops back to d7. White plays f4 and c5. Knight f3, knight c6. Very typical structure. White is having a nice space advantage and black will try to counter that space, that lack of space, by challenging the center with the move c5. White will try to reinforce its control over the d4 square. That's a very important square. Now it's occupied by a pawn, but who knows, maybe at some point it could be occupied by a minor piece. That could also be fine. And now Magnus goes for the system with the move a6. It's an interesting line. It's one of the many available moves. And black is normally speaking intending to grab some space on the queen side so that later on its bishop can be developed. But now the old main line here continues with the move queen d2. Now the modern line nowadays here is the move knight e2. That's a strange looking move, but we understand that the knight is trying to gain control over the d4 square, even ignoring its own development, because now the bishop on f1 cannot be developed. Instead of playing the move b5, which will probably be met by the move c3, and this is one of the ideas of White's previous move, White has a very nice pawn chain and it will be difficult to break it down. Therefore, instead of playing the move b5, Carlsen goes for the move queen b6, exerting pressure with the queen against the pawn on d4 as well as against the pawn on b2. So queen c1 and bishop e7 and white goes c3. So anyway, white succeeds in getting that wonderful pawn formation. The only question is, what is this bishop going to do next? Black is going to castle and now white plays the move g3. Very interesting clash. Here white is having a space advantage and black in the meantime is having some issues how to complete its own development. And therefore a typical strategy in the French is to try to break down that pawn formation. So you go here for the move f6. And of course, we would like to take and open up the file for the rook. Who knows, maybe the knight can even be attacked at some point by the rook. And white will never take on f6, because then the knight will come in. And since the pawn is no longer on e5, we have nice squares for our pieces. The knight can come in, the bishop comes there, and so on. White will stick to its pawn formation. That pawn on e5 is very important. And therefore white plays a simple move, bishop g2, with the idea to get its king into safety very shortly. Black decides now to take on d4, and after c takes d4, there is this option to take on e5 as well. But the reason why Magnus doesn't play this move is probably because now it will be easier for white to attack the pawn on e6 at the right moment, as the knight can come in to f4. Therefore, it's better from black's perspective to maintain the tension a bit and don't take on e5, as then the pawn from f4 can just be removed. Instead, queen a5 check was played and the knight comes in to c3 to block the check. And black plays the move knight b6. Very logical move with the idea to come in with the knight to c4, and probably also the bishop will come to d7 very soon as well. And this is an interesting moment because you don't really want that knight to come in here. So the most logical move would be to play b3. But then very annoying here is the move bishop a3, attacking the queen. The queen got to maintain control over that knight on c3. If you play queen d2, then very strong here is this move, knight a7. Remarkable idea. But let's say white doesn't understand what's happening. He's going to castle. Now you will see what the point is. Bishop comes to b4, pinning the knight on c3. Cannot move because that will drop the queen. If you protect the knight, now the knight comes into b7. Very typical tactical play, and you see that a move like b3 really does weaken the stability in white's position, especially the dark squares, but also the knight on c3. You understand? This bishop is looking for a way to cause some damage on the queen side, and therefore Fabi decides to take on f6. That's an interesting decision because black is no longer able to recapture with its knight. If the knight had been on d7, knight takes f6 would have been played, and then the knight has nice squares to jump to. This time Magnus decides to recapture with the bishop, and now the move b3 has been played. Black completes its development with the move bishop to d7. White does the same by castling kingside, and the rook comes over to c8. And now queen d2 was played. That is a very sensible move, trying to connect the rooks. And now the move bishop e7 is played. So the bishop is on its way back, trying to target the knight on c3. And therefore, since bishop is about to come to b4, white thinks, let's better move the knight away back to e2. It's interesting, yeah, that the knight went in the opening already from c3 back to e2, and now does it for the second time. And black accepts the offer to exchange queens. Queen takes d2, bishop takes d2. So we have an interesting queenless middle game with all the other pieces still on the board. How should we evaluate it? I believe that white is a bit better, still a nice space advantage, potentially a nice square for the knight on e5, and still black is also struggling to find suitable squares for its own pieces. Magnus played here the move rook c7, clearly hinting at the idea to double the rooks on the c-file and try to make it a battle for the open file. White plays its own rook on c1 as well, and now the other rook comes to c8. But probably this was wrong judgment by the former world champion, because the next move by Fabiano may come as a huge surprise to most of you. With these last two moves, it all seems that the battle is going to take place on this file. And then imagine pieces are going to be swapped. That will just take away the pressure from black. But can you see here the best move for white? It's a very nice idea, and it's based on the fact that this rook on c7 doesn't have that many squares to go to. After the move f5, black is in deep trouble. After e takes f5, there would follow bishop f4, and the rook is trapped. That means that white will win the exchange. Therefore, the pawn on f5 cannot be taken, but f5 is a really great move. Black played the move bishop a3, and the rook went away to e1. That's absolutely fine. You can still not take on f5 because of bishop f4, and therefore the move bishop b4 was played. Magnus is initiating the exchange of pieces. Bishop takes b4, knight takes b4. Looks as if black is getting a lot of play. Attacking the pawn on a2, the c-file is open, so probably the rooks are able to enter very soon. But as you can see, white is very fast, is now about to destroy the pawn chain. The pawn on e6 can now be taken. F takes e6, bishop takes e6, and now you understand why the rook went to e1. The file is open, and now knight f4 played, hitting the bishop with both the knight and the rook. And now the bishop got to decide where to go. If you drop back to f7, for instance, then something like bishop h3 is very annoying, hitting the rook. If the rook goes away, then the knight comes in, and all of a sudden you see that black's play didn't work out at all. Now white is taking over with all its pieces being excellently placed. If you're careless, let's say you take the pawn, there is knight takes f7. You cannot really take with the king because that places the king in an open file, in a discovered check, so that would win the rook. If you do instead take with the rook, there is bishop e6, and you win the exchange at least. So a lot of problems here. Instead, the bishop decided to go to f5. It's a more active square, but now after knight e5, the bishop is still unprotected, and there are potential tactics against that bishop. For instance, if you do take on a2, now the pawn on d5 can just be taken, and you're attacking everything. The knight hits the knight, the rook, and the rook hits the bishop. Knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, with check, king got to move away, and this rook takes f5. Bye-bye bishop. So black has to be very careful. And rather than grabbing that pawn on a2, the move g6 is played to support the bishop. But now white seizes the initiative with an excellent move. White played here g4, trying to force the bishop to go away, and the bishop went to e4, offering the exchange of bishops. But now, after bishop takes, d takes, rather than taking the pawn right away, because then black still has knight takes a2, things are not simple at all. But the move a3, very clever insertion in attacking the knight on b4. And after the knight moves, the pawn on e4 can be taken anyway. And this is a very interesting moment because it seems like you're going to lose a pawn. What black could do now is knight c2, forking the rook and pawn. If you do take the pawn, it's possible to take on a3, but now probably Fabiano was planning to play here the move g5 with ideas of bringing the knight to f6 with potential attacking chances against the king. And look, all white's pieces are looking at the black king. There are definitely mating patterns popping up, but also that d pawn is really getting strong while the knight on a3 is far away. Doesn't help in defense. But rather than taking the pawn on a3, a better defense would have been now to play rook e7. So that you're pinning the knight on e5, immobilizing the knight. In certain cases, you may just consider to take on d4, so that after rook takes d4, you can take on e5. Black is still fighting here, but instead, Magnus Carlsen played here the move knight 4 to d5. Looks very logical to set up a blockade on the d5 square so that this pawn cannot be pushed at the moment. But now there is rook takes e4 and white is a pawn up. But still, if you do exchange one pair of knights, let's say knight takes f4, rook takes f4, and now the other knight comes into d5. It seems to me that black should be able to hold. It's not easy at all. There is counterplay. Probably one pair of rooks can be exchanged, and the other rook hopefully can just go after the white pawns very soon. So this could be a good practical attempt. But instead, Magnus, maintaining the knights on b6 and d5, played here the move rook c3, just going straight after these pawns. But definitely he overlooked the next move. Knight d7. This is a fascinating tactical idea because you're putting your knight on pre. But if you do take on d7, the point is that the other knight can be taken, hitting the rook on c3. If the rook goes away, then there is the move knight to e7. With a knight fork, you are picking up the rook. So that means that the knight on d7 cannot be taken. But things are getting very unpleasant. White is exerting a lot of pressure on the black knights. Protecting knights are rarely a good thing. If you would take the other knight, then the key idea is to play knight f6 first with check. And now after king to g7, very good move now is rook takes f4. And still there are quite a lot of attacking ideas here. You do have an extra pawn, and if you try to regain the pawn with rook takes b3, then the rook comes back to e4. And just with a very nice small army, you do have quite some attacking ideas with rook e7 coming next. For instance, taking another pawn, rook e7, the king goes away, rook takes h7, king g5, and it's checkmate. So that's what happens when you have just three very strong pieces, two rooks and a knight, attacking a lonely king. And covering the 7th rank with your rook is also not a solution because of knight e8, and once again it's a devastating knight fork. In the game, there followed the move rook takes b3 instead. But now, knight takes d5, and materials even, but white's pieces are so much more active. And the key move now is rook e5, and black is in very deep trouble because the knight cannot maintain itself on this square. If you protect it with rook b5, there is rook takes d5, knight f6, and you do win the rook back and remain a piece up. If the knight comes into e3, Very interesting line. You're attacking the rook on f1. There would follow rook f6 with check. And now the problem is that the king doesn't have a good square to go to. If you go king h8, there is rook e7 and it's going to be checkmate on the next move. If the king comes to the f file, preventing the rook from entering on e7, there is this move, rook takes e3. After rook takes e3, it's a discovered check, opening up the f file, and next move you will take the rook on e3. Black's position is absolutely falling apart. Magnus therefore didn't place its knight on e3, but instead went to c3. But now after knight f6 check, the king is once again in deep trouble. If the king goes into the corner, we have seen there is rook to e7, and mate on h7 is simply inevitable. If you instead would go here for king g7, then there are a lot of ideas. You may give a check on e7, but it still can be met maybe by a king f8. But a simple line, what I could recommend here is also just to push the d-pawn. Now, by having placed the knight on c3, these two pieces are too far away from the action, and the other pieces, they are going to decide it on the king side. The d-pawn is about to be pushed, can not really be stopped. If you go knight b5, there is rook e7 check, king f8, and now look at this move, d6, trying to secure that rook on e7 with devastating threats like knight takes h7 and so on. If you do take the pawn, rook d7 is a very clever move, just attacking that vulnerable knight. The knight can move again, but now it's knight d5 check once again, and the king cannot be saved. If you go king g8, it is knight e7 winning the rook on c8, while if the king goes to e8, there is this move rook e7, king d8, and rook f8 with checkmate. Therefore, after knight f6, world number one had seen enough, resigned, and therefore Fabiano Caruana takes the lead together with Gukesh, who managed to win a very nice game against Alireza Firouzja. But it's a fantastic start of the tournament for Fabiano, not for Magnus, of course. But I think we have seen a very interesting model game from a White's perspective against the French. Hopefully you like the game as well. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. And we are back with more coverage from Norway Chess. See you soon.